Yes, Drosophila melanogaster, otherwise known as fruit flies, and they have been one of the bases of a lot of genetic research and a lot of so-called research into evolution. Um, but we're going to look at natural select. We're going to concentrate on natural selection, even though we will go into other aspects of evolution because they are all interconnected. This is a very big topic. So I've got a couple of examples of natural selection for us to start with, and then we can go into some. I know that John and Craig have some other examples as well. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of natural selection. This is one we wrote about a few years ago in our newsletter, so it's now in our fact file if you want to look up the details of this study. Australia is notorious for snakes and various other apparently nasty things. And so this was a story that the BBC likes to sort of rub it in that, Australia is this terrible place full of all sorts of horrible things. So Australian snakes are evolving. Snakes in Australia have evolved to counter the threat of invasive poisonous cane toads, scientists have found. Well, let's have a look at what they actually did find. Was it, as the BBC says here, an example of contemporary evolution? So what was going on here, and what was this study about? All right, it was to do with the snakes eating things like frogs and toads, and so snakes will also have a go at eating cane toads. But cane toads are poisonous. They have poison in their skin and particularly in some glands on the back of their heads. And if a snake eats one of these, there is a potential for the snake to die. And so scientists had a look at a couple of species of snakes that are particularly susceptible to this toxin. One is the red-bellied black snake, and another is the common tree snake. And they did find an example of natural selection at work. So this is a real process. And so this is how the BBC summarized this. But for two species of snake at least, natural selection has produced a defense. The snakes have developed relatively smaller heads and longer bodies. So what they did is they actually measured the overall body proportions of the snake, and in particular how wide they could open their mouths, which of course is related to how big their heads are. And the BBC then goes on, natural selection ensures these, that's the small-headed snakes, are the snakes that prosper and reproduce. Now think about that, because one of the other terms for natural selection is survival of the fittest. You've often heard that line in the context of evolution, survival of the fittest, same thing as natural selection. And so the end result was their head body traits, in other words, the the tendency to have longer bodies and narrower heads came to dominate in the population. So if you look at the population of snakes before and after cane toads, yes, there has been some change. But what sort of change is it? Well, basically, it's survival of snakes with thin heads. The fathead snakes died out, the thin head snakes survived, but no snakes have evolved. They are still the same species of snakes. It's just that because the thinner head snakes can't eat toads that are as big as the fathead snakes are, they get a smaller dose of the toxin, so they survive. They go on to reproduce, pass on the genes for the thinner heads, and so the next population of snakes, they can't eat big fat cane toads with lots of toxin in them, so they also survive. So after a few generations, yes, the body proportions of these two species of snakes may have changed, but nothing has evolved. The snakes already had that variation within their kind, and as Glenn said in his introduction, there is variation within kind. Natural selection, in fact, just decreases that variation. It does not produce any new kinds. And unless you can produce a new kind of a creature, you have not got any evolution. And in fact, natural selection works against evolution because it decreases the variation that you get within living things. That's now there are lots of examples of that going on these days, but it's a good example of how the word evolution just gets applied to any biological change these days. Let's look at a classic case that everybody knows about and that has become cemented in the teaching about evolution. And you've all heard the story of this industrial melanism in peppered moths, Viston vetullaria. Now, this is a moth that has two different forms that look very different from one another, but it is the same species of moth. There are some that have this speckled sort of body form in their wings, and that's where the term peppered moth comes from. They look like a white moth that's been sprinkled with pepper. But there is a variant where all of the spots, as it were, have coalesced. So it's called a melanic form or a dark form. All right, it's melanin, the black pigment that you find in animals and in humans. And the original experiment here, or the original observations that stimulated this to become sort of the prime example of evolution in action, was in pre-industrial Britain. The light moths were the dominant form. There were more light moths than there were black ones. And when the light moths are at rest in trees, they do blend in to the sort of background, because in pre-industrial Britain, the trees often have sort of mottly lichens growing on their bark. And so if a moth lands on one of those at rest, it will blend in. And that's rather nice. But the black moths would stand out on a background like that in the left-hand picture. However, when the Industrial Revolution came along, particularly in the Midlands and northern areas of Britain, there was a lot of soot and pollution about. The trees were blackened by this, the lichens died off, and a lot of the trees were black rather than mottled. And the dark moths could blend in, as it were, to the background. And dark moths seem to become dominant in post-industrial Britain. So what's happened here is that the light moths blend in to the lichen-covered trees, so they are disguised, as it were, but the dark moths are easier to see, and so they get eaten by birds, and the light moths survive. So again, we do have survival of the fittest. In this case, the fittest are the mottled ones that can be easily disguised. When the environment changed, you get the dark moths being able to blend into the soot-covered trees, so the lighter ones got eaten and the dark moths survived. So yes, survival of the fittest, a genuine observation. And in order to prove that this was a real change, there's a famous series of studies by a man named Bernard Kettlewell, where he released moths into different environments and recaptured them and then counted the numbers of light moths and dark moths. Now, this experiment did have a number of flaws in it, and it had come under some severe criticism since it was originally done. That was back in the 1950s. And there was a sort of ongoing debate between creationists and evolutionists about it. So finally, someone, a moth expert in Cambridge named Michael Majoris, decided, well, I'll sort this all out. I will do the experiment again, and but without the experimental flaws that were in Kettlewell's experiments. And he did, with observations in his nice leafy part of Cambridge where he lived. And he eventually came to the conclusion that, yes, this was a real change, and it was a real piece of natural selection, and therefore it was evolution in action. And he published his results in a few different scientific papers, but this is basically his summary. Industrial melanism in the peppered moth is still one of the clearest and most easily understood examples of Darwinian evolution. Now, notice he's gone from a leap from natural selection that's been observed to Darwinian evolution in action. And he went on to say this should be taught as such in biology classes. But let's look at what he found, as well as what the observations that were over the decades behind that. The moths are still the same species because the black and the peppered forms already existed in the pre-industrial times. They still exist in post-industrial times in the same areas of Britain. It seems to be really obvious to anyone who closely looks at this, they have not evolved. They are still the same species with still the same variation. It's common sense, but why can't evolutionist educators just let this go? Well, I think we can get some understanding of what's happening here. This is not just an academic scientific debate of what we call evolution, what we call selection, whether it's a case of naming things. There is a serious worldview issue here, because Michael Majoris made this comment back in 2004: to have people believe the biology of the planet is controlled by a creator, I think that's dangerous. Now, if you notice next to his name, we've got his dates, which indicates, yes, he has departed this planet. And I think he may have changed his mind about the biology of the planet being controlled by a creator. I don't know what he thought about before he left this planet, but if he persisted with this view of the world, I think he's found out what's really dangerous. It is dangerous to defy the creator of the planet, and that's why this issue matters. It's not just an issue of a few bits of scientific terminology and experimental design. It is a serious issue about people's lives. And if we can just go back to us now, I think John and Craig have some more to add, both about natural selection and about why it has become so embedded in the mindset of people that it's considered to be the ultimate proof of evolution.